Okay, good evening, all, and welcome to this virtual forum hosted by the Tobago Civil Net. I'm Dr. Stephen Shepherd and your moderator for tonight. Tobago Civil Net is a non-partisan group of Tobago civil society organizations and concerned citizens, all combining forces for the purpose of having collective input on Tobago's development. The body includes representation from education, agriculture and the environment, youth development, arts and culture, tourism, and the business sector. Key partners in Tobago CivilNet include Youth Votes Matter, Tobago Writers Guild, Tobago Entrepreneurs, Tobago Literacy Support, and Environment Tobago. Now, one of Tobago's CivilNet's objectives is to foster a very rich level of open discourse on matters that affect Tobago, with a view to the development of Tobago and its people. Tonight's topic is campaign finance transparency. And to help us examine issues related to campaign finance transparency are three esteemed and knowledgeable persons in the name of Ms. Chrislyn Moore, Mr. Anselm Richards, who will join us shortly, and Dr. Vanessa James. Now, over the years, the issue of campaign finance reform has been on and off the national agenda, and despite numerous calls by various stakeholders, the country faces yet another election without legislation to regulate how political parties and their candidates treat with the financing of the election campaigns by third parties. Now, as early as 2013, at the opening of the fourth session of the 10th Parliament, then President Anthony Carmona described election campaign financing as the veritable juggernaut that results in financiers abrogating political power unto themselves and thereby undermining the system of governance. In a sense, Carmona was alluding to the propensity for unchecked and unaccountable political spending to pave the way for grand corruption in politics. In February 2013, while he was presenting Elections and Boundaries Commission statement on constitutional reform, Chairman Norbert Nassau opened with a quote from Dr. Pinto Dichansi, which said, "Democratic elections and democratic governance involve a mixture of high ideals and all too often dubious and even sordid practices. Election campaigns and political party organizations, pressure groups, and advertising all cost money. This must be found from somewhere, and the financing of political life is a necessity and a problem." So, to lead us off tonight, I'd like to ask Ms. Chrislyn Moore a very direct question because she's a lawyer. So, Ms. Moore, do you think that a legal framework for an independent regulatory campaign finance committee should be established to address campaign finance reform? Your mic is off.
There we go. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. With regard to your very pointed question, I think it is time that a parliament is brave enough to give the people what they've been clamoring for over a decade, which is some kind of transparency in terms of how political parties and political actors are financed. I am not a fan of regulators per se in any sort of industry or any sort of field of endeavor. From my own experience, regulators tend to not be sensitive to realities. However, I am 100% in support of some form of legislative intervention to regulate this area of political activity. I think it could only strengthen our democratic processes, and it will certainly quiet a lot of the noise in the public space, much of it based on speculation, because in the absence of true information, people are entitled to speculate, and in what we find is that the speculation is wild, and you can't blame people for that.
So thank you, Ms. Moore. And we go straight to Dr. James. So, Dr. James, normally at the end of the year, there is a series where secretaries provide an opportunity. This is called the Year in Review, done by the Secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly. And the question is, does that Year in Review series provide an opportunity for inequitable public funding of an incumbent's campaign? And should the same media time that is afforded to the secretaries be afforded to all other parties? Dr. James, microphone, sure.
Yeah, I guess they're doing their prescribed duties, reporting to the people of Tobago every year. And there is no equal time in that sense. What is required, however, is a type of government here in Tobago that will provide the public with an opportunity to interrogate, investigate, and oversee the work of this body of executives you're talking about. What we're running here in Tobago now is a constitutional dictatorship because we have an executive council. We have no legislature outside of the executive council, no set of members who are just there to do the oversight function and investigate whatever the executive is doing and check the quality and report to the people, let the people participate in discussing it and so on and so on. So it's only if you have that kind of system in place, you would be able to ensure that all the players in the society, including the wider public, could get an equal voice in the discussion about what is achieved. So fundamentally, the proper answer to your question is that, yeah, we need equal time, but we can't get it with the current system. We have to restructure the THA, enlarge it, create space for a proper legislative component, create space for oversight and real discussion of the work that is being done across all parties participating, and create a space for a discussion that would include the public via proper hearings and so on. And only when you do something like that, you will get what you want as equal time.
Thanks, Dr. James. And while you're on the floor, can I ask you to give your own general perspective on the whole issue of campaign financing? And I'll ask Ms. Moore the same after.
Well, where Chrislyn was going is the right road. This is really not about campaign financing. It's really about political party financing. Remember, the way we run the country is that we allow for the contest of political parties to, in the elections, to form the government. The winner forms the government. The loser plays a role in the legislature. And to the extent that you want that process to have a strong oversight component, good governance, if you like, which is the essence of democracy, the presence of strong oversight of the executive, which must be a minority in principle in the legislative process. To the extent that you're going to have that, you need to have a system of political party financing that will facilitate the exercise of oversight by all non-executive members of the House of Representatives. So if you take the THA here and you developed it into a proper representative body, the non-executive members should be somewhere in the region of about 40 of the members compared to 10 in the executive council. So you need something 50 or more. And if you did that, for those 40 or more to practice the business of oversight, they would have to be able to take decisions that are independent of the executive. And to the extent that the executive is able to control how their political fortunes, whatever happens to them in their political ambitions, there will be no effective oversight. So you need to set up a party financing system that would anchor the independence of the representatives of the people outside of the executive in the House of Representatives, in the THA, in an expanded THA, for example. That would be the foundation on which you could get real effective political control of the enemy. Remember, in all democracies, the enemy is the executive. They are the ones who are the threat to dictatorship, the threat to democracy, so to say, and the threat of dictatorship. And so you need members in the House who are able to take decisions, to investigate what they're doing, to come to findings, to make decisions about it, to take votes, all independent of what this executive is doing in order to exercise oversight. And if they're financed through the executive, if they're financed through the party leadership alone, rather than through their constituents and constituencies and so on, or through independent party financing coming out of government, then they will not be able to exercise effective oversight. Let me just tell you that this is a ripe discussion all across the Caribbean that I'm involved in. Big discussion going on in Jamaica right now over the effectiveness of legislative oversight of the government. And this is the heart of the problem. The executive controls how the members of the legislature get into the parliament. And for that reason, they control their votes. So if you are able to reform party financing to allow for government to provide a platform without shutting down the entrepreneurship of the political entrepreneurs, if you're able to set a government financing platform under the political system so that members can get into the legislature without being beholden simply to their party leaders, then you will have a chance to have effective democracy and effective oversight. And I think that's the central issue. Campaign financing is just a part of that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. James. That sounds pretty much like political transformation. I hope we can get there. So
It is.
Yeah, so let me ask Ms. Moore, and Ms. Moore also has a political party, and Dr. James presented some pretty radical views. So Ms. Moore, what is your take on the broader view of campaign financing or political financing as Dr. James framed it?
Well, you know, I am always a fan of simple rather than complex. The first question we have to answer is, do we admit that political financing is necessary? Right? That is a question that has to be confronted and answered. And the fact of the matter is that political campaigns are expensive, they are costly, and the failure to engage in a political campaign is in itself a threat to democracy, because it means if you cannot afford to run in the race, then the people don't have an opportunity to choose you. So that there is nothing inherently wrong with parties being financed or individuals being financed. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, in my view. The second matter is, if we agree that there is nothing inherently wrong with that, I mean, quite frankly, there's only so much barbecue a political party could hold to raise funds. All right, that is unrealistic. That is something of the past. You know, that is the fundraising mechanism of 40 years ago. The political juggernauts that we are seeing now cannot be financed by a bake sale. So that's the first matter. The second matter is, if we agree that funding is important and it is important to our democracy, the question then is, where should it come from? There are some countries, European countries come to mind, some countries in Asia as well, where party financing comes in whole or in part from the government. So government coffers actually fund political campaigns. I mean, they are not, the funding is not limitless, of course, you know, but that is a way to ensure that, one, democracy is funded, democracy works, and two, because the mechanism is a government regulated mechanism, not only regulated, but government funded, then it is thought that might be an ultimate transparent move. So that's one option, and there are many options when you look at how parties and individuals and organizations can be financed. And I think those options ought to be explored. It is not simply a matter of tell us who gave you money, because that information in a vacuum means nothing. X could have given money to your campaign. It does not mean that X is now owed a favor, or that if X is employed by the state, then it is paid back. And I think because of the absence of a proper conversation in Trinidad and Tobago on campaign finance reform, every suspected campaign financier is assumed to be involved in a corrupt act with regard to the government, and that is wrong. So again, for me, two questions fundamentally to be answered. Is campaign financing necessary? And if so, who should finance campaigns and political organizations?
Thank you very much, Ms. Moore. Much food for thought. Now, for those of you who are now tuning in, today we are talking, or tonight we are talking about campaign finance transparency. And this is a reminder that this is being brought to you by Tobago CivilNet, which is a non-partisan group of Tobago civil society organizations and concerned citizens who are combining forces for the purpose of having collective input in Tobago's development. Tobago CivilNet extends an invitation to all persons and organizations interested in lending their voices to these discussions. You can contact Tobago CivilNet at tobagocivilnet@gmail.com or 487-9722 or at Tobago CivilNet on Facebook. Now, I'll go back to Dr. Norbert Masso's presentation on constitutional reform, and he said that it's the dubious and sordid practices that contrive to harm the public interest directly or indirectly by contaminating and corrupting the electoral process and thereby influencing political decisions that primarily suit sectoral or private interests, monopoly capitalists, among others, usurping political power in the corridors of government in the name of democracy. And he stated that while there is no incontrovertible evidence of any exchange of favors surrounding campaign financing in Trinidad and Tobago, there have been many suspicions and allegations in the press and in the public domain within recent times, with both the media and the public calling for the enactment of legislation to control campaign financing. So, Ms. Moore, how would you have responded to Dr. Masso at the time he had said this, if you had the opportunity?
Well, again, it is the absence of information that fuels suspicion. And so I cannot fault the goodly doctor for repeating what is the suspicion of the average citizen. And this suspicion, whether reasonable or not, it exists. And it exists because nobody is saying anything differently. But the fact of the matter is, even when you look, Dr. James mentioned earlier that this question is a question that is engaging our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, and in Jamaica, it is a subject of hot discussion. And I want to turn to the Jamaica question. Jamaica, their position proposes to say who could fund a campaign. So they have answered our first two questions: is funding necessary, and if so, who can fund? And they're saying you can be funded by private individuals, companies, diaspora groups, registered political parties, and candidates. Now, even if we had a list like that, your initial concerns, or the concerns initially raised by Dr. Masso, would still be alive, because private individuals funding election campaign raises questions. Companies funding election campaigns raises questions. All funding of election campaigns, particularly in small states, small island states like ours, will raise questions of corruption. Perhaps not because of the campaign funding itself, but because of the fact that we have taken it upon ourselves to be known as corrupt states. It is our owning of a corruption label that corrupts the question of campaign financing. So I don't think that those questions would be quieted, even if we were to say, well, these are the categories of persons who can fund and they must reveal themselves. It would not quiet the public suspicions that, well, these people who have more corn are feeding more fowl, and as such, they are getting some advantage that we could see or we cannot see.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Moore. Now, Dr. James is a mathematical economist and a statistician and econometrician. His credentials include being a senior policy advisor at the United Nations Development Program. He was also advisor to the government of Suriname and coordinator of the policy development unit of the Planning Institute of Jamaica. And he is also a founding director of the Policy Research and Development Institute. So with that background, Dr. James, I want to ask you, do you think that the limit of $50,000 and $25,000 per candidate for national elections and local elections respectively are being adhered to, and how can that be fixed?
But I don't know if it should be adhered to. I mean, Chrislyn made an extremely important point, which is that modern political organization is a multi-million-dollar business.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying, remember, this is not only about campaigns. The campaigns are the single biggest items of action that the parties undertake. But parties have to run all year. They have to educate their members. They have to go around and canvass support on issues outside of election time, and so on. Political organization to educate the public about a course the democracy should take is really what we are talking about from the party organizational standpoint. And from the standpoint of the running of the democracy, it is the capacity of the people through their representatives to oversee the work of the executive. That is the essence of the democracy. And none of that could be financed with $50,000. None of all of that I described there could be financed with $50,000 and $25,000 and that sort of money. You're talking millions of dollars. So the heart of the thing is that if you really are interested in building a democracy, and in a place like Tobago, we need to build a democracy if we are going to have a chance at developing our economy here and our wider society. If we're going to have any shot at running a democracy, we have to set up a type of government that allows for effective oversight of the executive. There is no doubt about that. And none of that could be done if we don't reform the way political parties are financed. I think it is in the public interest. It is in the interest of our democracy to reform. And the reform should go in the direction, first of all, of public financing. We finance our education, we finance our health, and those are, I would put the political process as on par with those as important elements driving our development. And we ought to finance that publicly, kind of like what Chrislyn is hinting at happening in some of the European countries. And you want to remember, Dr. Shepherd, that in the European countries, in the Nordic countries and so on, civil society organizations themselves are financed by the state because they want to protect the interests of the democracy in that context. So I am one who thinks that to anchor the democratic process in Trinidad and Tobago, we need to have public financing of political action. And we have to do it in a way that would ensure that the individual representatives from the constituencies can focus their attention on finding out what their constituents want. In other words, do representation, rather than go to parliament and do what the some of the members in the PNM said should be done, which is when you go to parliament, you first must represent your party. Well, we're running a democracy and we want you to go to parliament and represent your constituents, not your party first. And for that to happen, you can't spend all your time on the road looking for money. So and at the same time, we can't leave you with your hand in your political party leader's mouth, because all that means is the political party leader will force you to support the party in the parliament, and there is no room in there for oversight. Without oversight, you have no effective democracy. Remember that. That's the most fundamental point I want to make here tonight. And so I think you have to finance the parties publicly as a platform. Allow for the entrepreneurship, allow for the drives to raise money, go to the rich people and all that, and get money from them. All of that, I think you could allow for, but you ought to put rules in place to ensure that those funds don't end up in the pockets of the political leaders. We have enormous amounts of stories about that all over the country, not excluding Tobago itself. And you need rules of accounting and rules of financing to ensure that political financing doesn't become a major mechanism of corruption. But to allow representatives to be able to focus on representation rather than be diverted excessively to the agenda of raising money in order to conduct business that is such expensive business. Some minimum level of financing could be provided, kind of like what you do with the judiciary, to ensure that you could stiffen their spine and allow them to pay proper attention to the need to hear what their represented, what their constituents are saying, and go to parliament and represent that. As I was pointing out before, all of that is foundational, because in the context of a place like Tobago, we have other work to do to reform the THA itself. But when you talk about so when you're talking about democracy in Tobago, we haven't really started the discussion here yet, because the THA we have here leaves no room whatsoever for anything called democracy. Who wins is a dictator for the 4 years. But if you could fix that, you still will have this foundational problem of political party financing to sort out. I think that's a critical thing. Let me make one last point there, Dr. Shepherd. One of the things we're finding out from our work in Jamaica on this question is that the citizens of Jamaica, just this week I was told by one of my colleagues doing some corresponding work with me over there on that, the citizens of Jamaica making it clear they don't want to fund no political parties, and there are no money to fund them. Our people by and large are not rich enough to fund political parties on the scale that Chrislyn was defining the funding to be needed. So clearly, we have something to argue for from the standpoint of public financing to make up that void. It's not because they don't want to fund political parties. Much of it is the vast majority of our people are simply too poor to pay for their freedom. I fund political parties, but I can't fund the multi-million-dollar campaigns needed. So I know that there is some need for state support to carry the process along. And that would be the substance of the argument I would make.
Okay, thank you, Dr. James. You and Ms. Moore are saying the same thing, that there's a fundamental reform needed, a new model that has not yet existed in how political parties should be financed and funded. And I would, at this stage, welcome Mr. Amsterdam Richards, who's on, and ask Mr. Richards to turn his camera on so everyone can see him, and also ask him to weigh in on the whole question of campaign financing, political financing, and give his views on the comments that Dr. James recently just made. So, Mr. Richards, welcome.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Well, I was listening to the discourse with Dr. Varner James. Yes, there's definitely a need for us to deal with the whole issue of campaign financing and political party financing, or to formalize public funding of of political campaigning, because the current model that operates now is in an indirect way. It is being funded by the state, because the cycle you have is party government business. So through that network, the political parties are funded by business organizations or contractors, for a more simple description. And they invest in the political party that wins government, and they get government contract, and we know how the bidding process goes, and the money is passed back. So in an indirect way, the state is already funding political party, and that sets up a whole network for all kind of unscrupulous activities to take place. So what we probably need to do is to think about formalizing the process, setting up the rules as to how this thing should happen, how the accounting should take place, the reporting and all of that, what the money should be used for, how much a company can invest in a political campaign. But we must remember that we have a lot of political investors that call themselves businessmen in Trinidad and Tobago, and they invest in political party to get access to state resources. So that's how the system works. But definitely, when we look at what is happening, and if we have to deepen the democracy and purify the democracy, we need to control that whole issue of campaign financing. Because you have, for instance, you have hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in advertisement and other activities during an election cycle at the national level and also at the THA level. But when you look at, let us say, the earning of a candidate that will spend $2 million to win a seat, let us say in a THA election during a campaign, there is no way in terms of income coming to that candidate or that elected person can compensate for the $2 million so that they can share that out with contractors through contracts and get all kinds of returns coming back. So the problem we want to solve is how do we minimize that kind of relationship between political investors and political parties and government, so we can protect the population from those kinds of on-the-table arrangement with political parties and political investors in the society.
Okay, so Mr. Richards, thanks a lot. And you opened two doors there. So I want to ask you two questions in one. And the first question is, should the THA pass a bill that puts limits on contracts for emergency purposes only in the final year of its tenure? And related to that is, what are your thoughts on the procurement bill that was recently dealt with in the Parliament and that is going to the Senate tomorrow? Two questions, two adjoined questions.
Well, the thing is, the THA should pass legislation to deal with how we issue contract and whether contract should be issued in the last year of a government term in office. That is something I think the society should really have a deep and wide debate about, because what it does, it protects the public from those kinds of abuse that take place in the final year, and to set up the whole issue of campaign financing as a system is. So there need to be some kind of regulation. I think in the last year or the last 9 months of our government life, there should be a kind of freeze on the issuing of contracts, unless we are able to set up the whole regulation for campaign financing. Well, that would probably solve part of the problem. Or if we can really activate and operationalize in a pure and direct way the procurement legislation, that will protect the public from what is happening now. But we see that political parties are not really, or governments are not really prepared to have a strong public procurement arrangement that will obstruct them from doing the things that they're doing and to get access to the kind of funding that are necessary, not only for campaigning, but to sustain their parties throughout the year, as it were. In terms of the bill that is now going to the Senate, I think it's an embarrassment to the country for the changes that were made to that legislation. I think if we want to have transparency and good governance, we really need to control public expenditure, and we really need to have that kind of independent oversight, that independent regulator that looks at how contracts are issued in Jamaica, and Vanders can bear this out. There is a contractor general that has superpower where contracts of state are issued and so forth. So we really playing games in Trinidad and Tobago, for want of a better description, by reducing the authority and the checks and balance of the procurement officer in the legislation on certain activity of government is really a travesty of justice for the public.
Thanks, Mr. Richards. Can I ask Ms. Moore to weigh in on the same question, the issue of contracts in the last year of the THA and the procurement bill? What are your views, Ms. Moore?
Yes, well, let us restate your question, which is should the THA pass a bill? Let's not fool ourselves. The THA has no power to pass any bill, right? So if they make some promises on the floor of the House, nobody should take that to the bank. And in fact, right where those words drop, just consider them burnt, all right? So that when you say things like, should the THA pass a bill, it suggests that the THA has authority to make laws or to make regulations that are enforceable, or that they are compelled to do what they say, and they have no such authority. So that's the first thing. They could say what they want, and then the next day they can do something completely different. And that's okay, because they do not have any power to make any law. So that's the first thing. So if I could be allowed, with respect, to reframe your question and to ask instead, should there be a policy decision, not only in Tobago, or well, we're dealing with Tobago, so should there be a policy decision where in the dying days of an executive, that there be some kind of moratorium on the signing off on contracts? I would have a difficulty disagreeing with that. Because of course there is the public perception that if you are signing a contract on, the eve of something as significant as an election, that you are hedging your bets, that you may well be saying, look, I might come back, so this might be my last opportunity to either make some mischief and dirty the waters for the fellow who comes, and we're seeing a lot of precedent for that in North America. Or alternatively, it might be my opportunity to get what I didn't get in the last 4 or 5 years. Now this may be pure conjecture, but these are the concerns of the public, and certainly it would be an excellent public policy position to take and to adhere to. I think whatever government takes that position, whether as a policy position or if you're talking Trinidad and Tobago as a legislative position, I think that would win it significant plaudits from the public. So that's one. Going back to our core question of financing and financing political organizations, I unfortunately have an intimate position about what it costs to run an election campaign, and in particular, an election campaign in Tobago. And when I embarked on that journey 5 or so years ago, back then, the average cost of a political campaign in Tobago was $3 million back then. So the question now is, are members of the public prepared to fund that, going right back to Dr. James's observation that our people may be too poor to engage in funding their freedom? I really like that phrase, because really and truly, the political party is the vehicle through which or by which democracy is delivered. So that's one thing. The other bit I want to touch on is, what could public funding achieve? For those of you who have heard me before, I mean, one of my pet projects, of course, is the advancement in the politics, in social life, in public life, for women and girls. And so for me, the question of funding of political parties, whether this funding comes through any one of our agreed people that can fund, or whether it comes from the state itself, and Anselm suggests that the state is already funding, so we should formalize that process. For me, I want to know if, not that I want to know, but I want to suggest that one of the reasons the state should be involved in funding political campaigns is to make sure that more women participate in governance, because it is glaringly obvious that women they constitute, or we constitute, about 70% of any political party's grassroots. You just have to open your window between 3 and 5 when all of the political parties are walking about, as they're doing right now, and you will see a grap of women of all ages, of all stations, of all stripes. But when you look at the head of that group, meaning the individual that those women are working for, 9 out of 10, it's a man, right? So you have women on the ground propelling men into political office. And you have talented women on the ground who are frowned upon when they try to get financing for their own political ambitions. They are shut out of the golf courses that need grooming or don't need grooming. They are shut out of the corridors of power by institutionalized sexism and the proverbial glass ceilings. But they are the foot soldiers in every politician's war. So for me, funding, party funding and government funding of political organizations can have the opportunity of targeting, of having a targeted effect of putting more women in office. For example, your funding, government funding, could be tied to how many of your candidates are women. So, okay, we fund everybody $10 across the board, but you get an uplift of 0.1%, let's say. Dr. James, math is not my thing, so you forgive me up front. But you get an uplift of, let's say, 0.1% for every candidate that is female. Now, this model works well as well to get other interest groups who do not normally see the corridors of political power involved. So it will work the same way for your disabled. There are not many disabled people in the parliament as we speak. I mean, between 2010 and 2020, I know of one disabled person who sat in the Senate, and that would have been Senator Roach. He is not the only disabled person in this country, and certainly disability rights activists have not been seeing the corridors of power. Perhaps this is one avenue where you can ensure full participation from short of proportional representation, because you will get this, as Dr. James will say, you can get this kind of color if you had a proportional representation system. But in the absence of that, perhaps this is one way to tweak so that you can get more involvement from these groups.
Thanks, Ms. Moore. That's a strong advocate there for inclusive politics. And it sounds as if we are not nearly inclusive enough, because there are a number of silent groups in the society who, for some reason, are excluded. Thank you very much. So, Dr. James, your take on the whole issue, on the same issue of the politics, the contracts in the latter half of the THA's term and the procurement bill.
Before I answer that part of your question, let me agree and in a way commend Chrislyn for her comments regarding inclusiveness, and they need to level the playing field with respect to the opportunities for women to play a significant role in the political system we have here. But I want to take you back on this matter of what should happen towards the end of the term, and make a case for continuity of government. I think I am not a big fan of shutting down contracting and all the other devices government needs to do its job at any time in the life of the government. I don't think the solution to the potential corruption and misallocation that is in the offing there, is to shut down action. I think what you have to do is reform the THA. Take a look at what the THA really is. You have 15 members in it. Right now, 12 of them in the executive council. So what you've done in Tobago is you've elected a dictator. There is simply, and the people of Tobago must confront this fact. There is simply no oversight of the executive council in Tobago. It does as it pleases, and it even in the law has retroactive power. Do what you want and then go back and approve it in the house itself when you're ready down the road. We need to fix that. And if we fix that, then in Tobago, we could have a properly functioning, say, public accounts committee to underwrite and drive implementation of financial rules and so on. And if you have functioning oversight committees like a public accounts committee, we have one in Trinidad and Tobago that doesn't really work very well because of the structure of government down there. But here, we don't even pretend to have something to oversee in the House, a dedicated committee to look at how the THA is spending Tobago people's money and investigate Auditor General reporting of wrongdoing and pass laws to address the wrongdoing. We're not even pretending that we're interested in that as Tobagonians. We innocently been going down the road for 40 years, running a dictatorship here, as though it doesn't matter. Now, if we fix that and we put in place a parliament with capacity for oversight of executive council action, then one of those committees would be a public accounts committee. And that committee would then be able to look at the practices with respect to contracting and so on. And at any time, whether it's when the contracting is being done, after it's been done, when it's being executed, or at any stage along the way, the oversight committee could take a look and say, hold on, something is going on here that we don't like, and we are going to take action. And if you build this system in a proper way, then the public's interest through the oversight committee could give rise to real democracy and block all of this, this abuse at any stage in the term. Start of the term, end of the term, middle of the term, whatever. And remember, that holds not just for the finance and public accounts. That holds for education, health. It holds, even to some extent, it would put a damper on the abuse of the political system by the elite, who could fund the political leaders and then dominate the decisions of the parliament, to the detriment of the vast majority of the citizens who want to get their voices heard, but sidelined because of the way the parties are financed. So I think my fundamental answer to your potential corruption issue is Tobago needs to wake up and end this historical, let me say historically awful practice of cultivating a dictatorship here in the name of government. Clean it up, reform it, and give all our people a real shot at practicing democracy from day to day. And it is on that basis that all of these problems will be sorted out. And by the way, it's also on that basis that proper funding of political parties could be done with the oversight of the people, because whatever rules you set for reporting and so on, you can have your parliamentary representatives weighing in on the content and the nature of those rules and allow for the funds that are put up by the public to bring along with it some right to ask parties to report properly on what has happened to the money, where they got the rest of the money they spent, what has happened to it, and bring some sanity to the process. So I think what we're really talking about here, when all is said and done, is fundamental reform of the THA, which is the heart of the whole debate Tobagonians ought to be having about why we ought to have a reform of our constitution to provide for Tobago's rights to set up a proper government.
I want to say as well that, all right, I think Tobago civil society, we've all agreed that there is a need for reform at the THA level. There is need for constitutional reform. That clearly is not coming. Or at least it's not on the horizon in any form that would be acceptable in a very polarized political system. That is our reality. We may wish it were otherwise, but that is our reality. So what in the meantime is the question that I am asking. And for me, I am always taken to the point where I'm reminded, I should say, that the public officers hold the key, you know. Public officers ought not to fall under the spell of the politician. The politician is temporary. He or she will fade. It is the integrity and the ethics of the public officer that will hold the system together until such time as reform comes. And I think why we are feeling so imperiled in Tobago is that there are real questions as to whether public officers are filling their roles. And I know that that is an unpopular position to have, particularly as a politician. Luckily, of course, I am former, so it doesn't really matter. But that is a legitimate question. Are public officers fulfilling their roles as guardians of the public purse in the face of what may be corrupt politicians and in the absence of legislation? I think that is something we have to look at, because some system must be holding us together until such time as we get the legislative reform we so urgently need. But if the whole system collapses, then by the time legislative reform comes, by the time constitutional reform comes, we are back in the Stone Ages and trying to work our way back to 2025. That cannot be.
Christine,
Sure.
that's a very interesting point you are raising. But if we have to continue along the path that Vanus would have said, that government in Tobago under the current structure of the THA and the legislative provision that establishes the THA is really a dictatorship. There's no room for no public servants to hold the fort until change comes. You have seen the abuse that the administration have unleashed on Tobagonian in the last 20 years. You know, they have turned politics in Tobago into a religion. If you're not part of us, you can't participate. So there's no room. Public servants are blissfully afraid to really take any strong position against these abusive politicians in Tobago because there is no recourse. So the system has to change, and the change has to come from a kind of awareness of the people that what is happening in Tobago is not the interest of the island and the island people. It's just a small group of people, and there must come a point in time where we have to say they have had enough, and we have had enough.
Well, when is that? And you know, going right back to Dr. James's point, and this is a point I have heard you make time and time again as well, Anselm. The freedom of Tobago, I should say Tobago's freedom, the freedom of Tobago's people, the freedom of Tobago's politics, the freedom of Tobago's legislature. We don't have the power as yet to give it to ourselves. We represent 2 votes, 2 seats in a legislature of 41. We represent 50,000 people in a population of 1.3 million. We are 5% of our population thereabouts. So that in order to get what we need buy-in from elsewhere. And elsewhere seems, if what we are seeing, we are interpreting correctly, elsewhere is either preoccupied with its own business or it is in cahoots with whoever to keep us where we are. There, of course, are radical positions as to radical opinions as to how we can extricate ourselves. And certainly, I know that this process that we are engaging in is part of that. I mean, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the civil society net, right? But certainly, this is part of a radical move to start in, you know, important conversations in Tobago in the hope that these conversations spread elsewhere. And I commend that. However, perhaps I am more of a pessimist than an optimist. And so while hope lives eternal, you know, certain realities of the numbers, you know, do not support what we want. I mean, Dr. James, of course, has walked this road much longer than me, and he has seen changes in places that I'm sure nobody could have foreseen. And so I rely heavily on his encouragement in this regard. But for my own part, particularly having sat where I have sat, I do not see us bringing about a constitutional change in our circumstances because it does not empower anybody but us, and we are 5%.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. And just a station check for those who are joining us now. Tonight we're talking about campaign finance transparency. And just a reminder that the Tobago Civil Net is a non-partisan group of Tobago's civil society organizations and concerned citizens who are all combining forces for the purpose of having collective input on Tobago's development. So we continue the discussion. We have 2 questions online. I'll go to the first question. And Ms. Moore, based on where you sat, it may be a question you may want to tackle. And it is, should candidates be required, and I think they're referring to election candidates, be required to make their assets, liabilities, and tax returns to be elected representatives public? So I think what they're asking is whether people who are offering themselves for political posts should make their assets, liabilities, and tax returns public. What are your views on that?
I would not be in favor of that. We are a very, very small society, and the impact of information like that is not going to be muted as it would be in a population of, you know, 10, 20, $30 million, 30 million people, sorry. So that I think that people deserve some privacy. More than that, there is a mechanism in place as it is for the filing of reports with, or the organization slips me now, but Anselm and Dr. James can help me. The Integrity Commission. Right. So there is that process. And you know, for those who may be unfamiliar, if you hold one of the positions where you are reportable to the Integrity Commission, they actually ask for your data for 2 years before you assume the position. So if you win elected office in 2020, you are required to report to the Integrity Commission of all your assets and liabilities for 2020, 2019, and 2018, and then straight through your term, and then for 2 years after. For me, that is sufficient.
Okay, thanks. And there's another question I suspect Ms. James, Ms. Moore would have been in response to a comment you had made earlier. And the question is this: has the THA tried to pass a bill or policy and send it to Trinidad and had it refused? They do have a certain level of autonomy currently, but is the current level even being utilized in any meaningful way or at all? So they're asking whether the THA has ever tried to, the same point you made earlier.
I think Dr. James and Anselm would have more data than me. I know anecdotally that something was sent, and of course it went nowhere, and it was sent back, and it was a whole fiasco. It's quite embarrassing. But I have the answer to the second part. The answer to the first part of the question is yes, and the answer to the second part of the question is also yes. But I have fundamental issues that I know I have a fundamental issue with the whole question of Tobago getting lawmaking power. I am not convinced that that is necessary. I am not. I know that it is an ideal and an aspiration, but I am not convinced that it is necessary. I feel that there may be another formula to get our matters into the statute books. And quite frankly, I don't see us as having so radical an identity that we need, our own legislature like Ireland, our own legal system, Scotland does, our own courts. I don't see us as being so completely culturally and historically different from Trinidad that those things need to be institutionalized. But I know that that is not necessarily a popular opinion. It just happens to be mine.
Thanks a lot. And we haven't heard from Dr. James for a while. Dr. James, your views on the THC and its level of autonomy and what the Act 40 of 1986 affords it right now?
Well, we will have...
expand a little bit on your radical views on how the system should operate. Given where we are, how
we will have a chance in another couple of days. We will have a chance to talk about autonomy completely. But I speak as a scientist, economic science and political science. And from that perspective, Tobago is in a battle for its development with Trinidad and with the world. And when you're in that battle, the most important capability you must bring to the table is the capability to make decisions that will drive up your capacity to compete for development opportunity. And from that perspective alone, I would wish to engage in a careful discussion with Chrislyn about the position that she's holding from the standpoint of law, so she could understand what I know about what Tobago ought to be doing to develop its prospects, the moral hazard that it confronts from Trinidad and has confronted ever since 1889. Trinidad has benefited from dragging its feet on matters relating to Tobago's self-determination. Because it gets our skilled labor, it keeps control of like our gas north of us, for example. Rowley said the other day, that's Trinidad and Tobago's gas. Geographically, it's Tobago's gas, but from his standpoint, it's Trinidad and Tobago's gas. Although Trinidad's gas and oil was always Trinidad's gas and oil. So, there is moral hazard, and it is not perceived in Trinidad's best interest for Tobago to develop, just in case we get hot under our collar about secession. Well, that's their business. But from the standpoint of what we are trying to achieve here, and from the standpoint of the 130 plus years of no progress on development, we need genuine autonomy in order to be able to engineer the kinds of things that will make us develop. And let me say, most of what the nation needs to do to transform the national economy away from oil and gas really has to be done here in Tobago. And yet, so far as we can tell, Trinidad has no abiding, surely is not displaying any abiding interest in doing those things. And whenever you propose them, as I have, they see it as an affront. So we need the capacity to make our laws to drive our development. We cannot continue to run a government like the THA. We have no chance with the THA to develop our Tobago economy. No chance. And if we do not put the ideal system, government of the people, for the people, by the people, with effective legislative oversight and so on, if we don't put that kind of system in place here, we have no options to bring our people into the development process. So how are we going to, if we leave it always up to Trinidad to make the rules we must follow in order to compete for economic space? If we do not have the autonomous, the right to set up a system here to make rules of competition that will allow us to win, what chance do we have for the next 1,000 years?
Yeah,
So I am not
clear. Develop and development. I suspect people have different understanding of what you mean by develop and development. Just clarify first, what do we really mean by develop? Is it big roads and big buildings?
No. We're going to cover all of that a week and a couple of days. But the main point is, the main strategy you need if you are at Tobago is something we have wanted to do since 1884 with the crash of agriculture, which is to build a skill base here of people with our neighbors in Trinidad, with the rest of the world, but a base of human capabilities to engineer a way out of the poverty driven by agriculture. We need to build an economy that is driven by education, healthcare, creative industries, and so on. And the investments required for that, we'll talk about down the road. We'll talk about that in a week, going down the road, why we need a ferry. But the important point I want to make is that's the driver of what we call development, growth of our productivity, growth of our savings capacity, growth of our capacity to export. And we can't get any of that by letting Trinidad make calls. Then they're not interested in it. They don't think we should or could do it. They don't have any confidence that we could do anything more than depend on them. They've never had it for 130 years, and they won't have it now, even with Dr. Rowley as Prime Minister. So we need to have our own capacity here to shape our own rules, our own principles, our own strategies and techniques, including techniques to compete with Trinidad for opportunity. Build on the platform that our tourism allows that they don't have, all right, and see where we go. So I would not give up that opportunity to develop, to depend on Trinidad. And I would not allow Trinidad to make rules for us to shape that development path. I don't think they are interested in it. I don't think they understand it. And I don't think if they understood it, they would be willing to do it, because they would be afraid of the implications for them, just like they never wanted to have deep water harbors anywhere around Tobago, because it could damage the Port of Spain and Point Lisa's options. So they won't want us to do a university here that will compete with whatever of infrastructure they have down there, or a finer hospital here that would make them have to come here to get high quality health care rather than say go California or go West Shore. In other words, this is a whole different discussion that requires next week for us to go through. But right now, I would indicate that I do not agree that we should not have the right to make the rules that will allow us to win in the world space.
Okay, Dr. James, thank you very much for that. I want to change directions a little bit now. When you look at Jamaica, there have been two political parties for a very long time. Barbados, similar, and many of the islands in the Caribbean. Tobago, however, had a new political party fairly recently. In fact, not one, more than one. And the question is, do you think, and it's the three of you, that new political parties can really compete with the incumbents without making quid pro quo deals to get financing? Has that successfully worked anywhere in the Caribbean, the emergence of new political parties? How can one create a new political party and bring it up to the level of those who've been here since 1956 and 58 and 1990 and so on? Mr. Richards, you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, let me just go. I'll land my aircraft on that one. Well, let me just go let me just go back to what Vanos was saying a short while ago. And I'm 100% or 120% in agreement with Vanos. You know, and Christine is very aware of my position in terms of Tobago's autonomy, Tobago's right to self-determination. And for me, that's an absolute right. You know, I don't think we have to ask anybody in Port of Spain to give us that. I think Tobago have surrendered that right too easily to Port of Spain, but that's a deeper conversation. I said last time I was on this forum that the first fillip in our economic transformation is internal self-government. And it's basic as that. The first fillip in our economic transformation and growth and development is internal self-government. Without that, nothing happens in Tobago. Because just granting the granting of internal self-government or the realization of internal self-government will instantly create hundreds of jobs to deal with those type of things that Vanos is articulating. In new areas of responsibility, new institutions, new arrangement, high-paying jobs, indirect jobs. You know, that will have an immediate impact on aggregate demand, and the economy will start to move. So the first fillip in the economic transformation of Tobago is internal self-government, but that's another conversation. In terms of political parties, I think across the West Indies, Caribbean, I think basically what we have seen over the years is really a two-party system. You know, there are some parties that have longevity. They have been around since the 1950s, early 60s and all of that. And they have strong institutional platform from which they launch their political operation. And there are some parties that have died off and new ones built in and all of that. But I think politics, a day in politics is a long time. And once you have a good organization and you have a good ground game, I think any political party or any organization in an election can win an election. You know, I understand the history and the strength of organization will always have the tendency to push the organization to the tape. But I think we have seen, let us look in Tobago. The PDP have came on the scene in less than 5 years, and they are big significant inroads. As a matter of fact, they are the third largest political party in terms of public support through election in Trinidad and Tobago. The PDP is larger in terms of its vote count than David Abdullah party that has been around some years before. So recency is not really a punishment in politics. It's how you organize and what you are. If you commercialize or if you take the politics as a commodity, is really the brand and what you are offering and the integrity and all of that comes with what you are offering that will really make the difference in what your outcomes will be in any election.
Right, thanks. And Ms. Moore, how do you weigh in on that? The issue of the new political parties.
I can't remind myself of your original question. It was along the lines of whether new parties stand a chance in Tobago.
Yes, and in getting the financing without making deals to get financing.
Well, you know, going back to our earlier conversation, the financing has to come. And the question is, what is the political organization, new or old, prepared to do or not do? I mean, let us not suggest that because the political organization is new, that it is making a deal, or it is making a deal that the old political organization is not making. It's the same ecology, whether you are a new political party or an old political party, right? So that's one thing. The problem that new political parties have is that funding is limited, so that if you are the incumbent, chances are you have a history, as Anselm has said, and as you've said, you have a history. In other words, you know where the pots of money are buried because you've been digging them up over the years, right? For a new kid on the block, he or it does not represent necessarily an investment, if we are to use Anselm's language. It is not necessarily an investment that a political investor will take. It is a risk. It's not an investment, it's more like a gamble. And there are few actors, few financial actors that are willing to gamble. They may be willing to invest and take a risk, but a gamble is a different matter. This question is magnified by the amount of new political parties asking the same political venture capitalists, if you will, to consider them as a vehicle for growth. Because political venture capitalists have a fixed amount of money that they are prepared to launch into the political space. In fact, there are a few of them to begin with that are prepared to fund outside of the established behemoths. And those that are prepared to fund outside of the political behemoths only are prepared to fund so much. If we agree, or if we consider that, as I said before, a political campaign in Tobago costs $3 million, and there are 10 new parties, the 10 of them require the same amount of funding, but there may be only 2 political venture capitalists willing to fund. And between the 2 of them, they may only be willing to fund $3 million. So immediately everybody is out of the race. And so democracy is again at risk. And that is the real struggle for political parties in the Tobago space, that they are relying on a limited amount of venture capitalists and they continue to expand, therefore shooting themselves in the foot. And so the mathematics of it all suggests that another approach ought to be considered.
Thanks, Ms. Moore. Really deep food for thought. We have a lot of work to do. Dr. James, can I have your take on this, please?
I kind of agree with both Anselm and Chrislyn. And there should be no mistaking that the oldest party that we are dealing with here, which is the PNM, makes deals. It makes 2 kinds of deals. One set of deals with the limited financiers of the small number of financiers that we have here in Tobago, the small number of business guys who can provide them with $500,000 or $1 million to do some things here in Tobago. There's a lot of talk all around the town. People tell you, good friends who know you and so on will tell you who's doing what. And we know the PNM participates heavily in that process. And then the Tobago PNM depends heavily on the one in Trinidad, the peers in Trinidad, to raise money from the rich elites in Trinidad and share in the pool. So when people say, well, where PDP gets financing, for example, I always ask, well, where PNM does get financing? You know, we have to ask the same question for everybody. They are all making deals like Chrislyn said. I also agree with Anselm that young parties, in my lifetime, I have seen, we had an intransigent, an enormously difficult political problem in my youth of trying to remove the PNM from office. And I saw young parties succeed repeatedly in that. NJAC shook up the landscape in 1970. NAR and DAC and NAR, DAC first, then NAR, shook up the landscape and ultimately succeeded in removing the PNM from office. Those were also new outfits. And the People's Partnership was a relatively new outfit, new clothing of an old outfit at least. And it was able to succeed. I think the fundamental lesson is not so much the the newness or the oldness, as that there's a certain sociology underlying the politics and underlying the drive to change. And there is a 40% of the society that is risk averse and has a tremendous orientation to stick with the center-right type politics of the PNM, to be quite blunt. And that's why the PNM tends to get about 37, 38% in every election of the electorate vote. And if only 52 or 53% of the electorate votes, then you know what is going to remain for the other party. But the other side of that is there's a driver of change in that sociology. Let me call them the children of the field slaves, those who want to fix the society. They are willing to take the risks and break up the old order and so on. And they scare the inheritors of the house slave culture. And so, so you have a tendency for them to have difficulty really moving the society because they have to bring a radical agenda, you know, like you want autonomy for Tobago. That makes people nervous. You want to secede and stuff like that. And so there is this side of the political sociology that makes it more difficult for those who want to make real change to succeed. And that's what happens to the so-called new parties. They are really largely radical parties that want to fix the history of racism and underdevelopment and all that sort of stuff, rather than simply go on depending on the government and depending on the old order and not making any fundamental changes. They have a more difficult time, but they do shake up the society from time to time, and they are the fundamental promise on which real success for new parties would ride. So new parties can succeed, and old parties make very corrupt deals in the treatment with the politics, including in the context of Tobago, including depending on large transfers from Trinidad to the local community. And that's true of the PNM. And I can't say for any of the other parties because I know they struggle for money, but I know for a fact that that is true of the PNM because I know plenty high-powered PNM people who tell me the truth.
And Dr. James, so that takes you right into a question I was just posed, and I'll read it. It's pretty long, but it seemed to have been in response to what you said. It could be argued that campaign financing as currently constituted encourages corruption, buying and selling of patronage, strengthens an already tight grip of a small clique on political power and decision-making. Will transparency merely erect an impregnable glass partition through which such processes can be seen, rather than obscured as presently exists? Academic sounding question. How do you respond to that one?
Well, the person who wrote that question is heading down the right road. There is a long historical concern with the excessive influence of the historical elite in Caribbean societies. I see it all over the Caribbean where I work, where the old oligarchy and the old rich inheritors of the plantations and so on are able to finance politics on the scale Christine was talking about. And then they have an inordinate influence on the types of policies that those who win with the money they give them would pursue. And they are among the greatest barriers to fundamental change that our people have been seeking in this region for the longest while. Transparency and all the other things that you are describing there will only help to fix that problem if it's done through the oversight process. Effective transparency, like effective accountability, is transparency and accountability with oversight. That's really what we mean when we talk about good governance. When you say accountability, it's not good accounting. When you say transparency, you don't mean write good reports. What you mean is you set them up and then allow for an oversight mechanism in the legislature to take them and hold the executive to account. And remember, in our constitution, Christopher knows better than I do, the executive is supposed to be accountable to the parliament as a whole, although the design makes that completely ineffective. So if you want to fix the problem of the excessive influence of the moneyed class, you have to fix the design of our governance, which was never there from the founding years of our post-independence life of independence and after. We never built the society so that the people of the society could exercise oversight of the executive. Yeah, in fact, when CLR James raised that issue with Eric Williams tell him that any government of the people of the kind that he's talking about, when he said every cook can govern, let the people have a say. Williams says a communist government you're looking for, that sort of stuff. So we've never built a government to allow anywhere in the region to allow our people to systematically, through effective representation and effective oversight, control what the kings do. And if you want transparency and you want a way to limit the influence of the monies of the rich and give all of us some sort of influence on the political process and the decision-making process, you have to reform the systems of government all over the region, but especially starting with this very worst case we have right here in our own Tobago Island.
We are almost to the end, but Operator, I want to ask you and Mr. Richards a last question on the plantation economy. To what extent is it still valid? To what extent should we still know about it? The work of Lloyd Best and Kyle Levitt. And you mentioned some of the descendants of the plantation owners and the financial resources they still control. How valid is the theory of plantation economy in today's world?
Who are you asking that?
Both you and Mr. Richards.
Well, I grew up with the author of Plantation Economics. This was my teacher and friend, Lloyd Best. And so I can tell you fundamentally, first of all, in my lifetime, there's been fundamental change in what we would, I mean, I grew up on an estate, so that tells you something. The estate is now almost defunct.
Okay.
So the plantations in the agricultural sense have pretty much all disappeared on the Caribbean landscape, to say nothing of Tobago. Plantation type institutions outside of agriculture have survived in oil and gas and in manufacturing, these kinds of institutions that Best described as institutions that tend to buy their inputs from abroad and produce highly specialized outputs to sell abroad, and not have in place inside the society any capacity to create what economists call capital inputs, make output that you use to make other output. That still is not in place. So many elements of what they described in plantation economics are still present, and including the high levels of dependence. But we've come a long way. The musicians have changed the landscape of the Caribbean, and we now have a very viable, emerging capacity to innovate on which we can build. You still have governments that don't understand what that means in terms of the development of our education system, the reform of our education system, especially the tertiary export capability, the reform of our healthcare systems, and so on. And they need to treat the carnival industries as industry in the way, in my work with WIPO, I have been trying to champion for the longest while. So we've started to make a lot of progress down that road, all over the region too. I mean, reggae, what's going on in Barbados with the carnival industries and all around the region. Chrislyn knows that lifestyle pretty well, that we've been making a lot of progress there. So this is not quite the plantation economy of Best and Levitt. We've been making a lot of good progress. The biggest barrier and the biggest thing they complained about, especially Best, to real progress and accelerated progress is the governance. What Anselm was saying when he said, without autonomy, we ain't going nowhere in Tobago. That is such a true hypothesis. Without autonomy, you ultimately, without good governance, you ultimately are locked into many of the elements of a plantation economy. And in particular, your capacity to compete with the world is stifled, and you really can't make rapid progress. But we're not quite a plantation economy anymore.
Okay, thanks. Good to hear. So we have to wrap it up here. I wish we could continue for another hour and a half, but unfortunately our time is up. So people who are tuned in, you have been listening to a discourse on campaign finance transparency that was brought to you by the Tobago Civil Net, which is a non-partisan group of Tobago civil society organizations and concerned citizens who are combining forces for the purpose of putting inputs together, collecting their resources, all in the interest of Tobago's development. So we want to close by sincerely thanking Dr. Vanis James, Ms. Chrislyn Moore, and Mr. Anselm Richards for taking the time out tonight to share their deep insights with us, and for deepening and enriching the discourse and educating the population on another aspect, a critical aspect of life in Trinidad and Tobago, because politics is part of our life. We cannot escape it. As Dr. James said, we have to shape it right. We have to get more autonomy in Tobago to foster its development. So at this stage, I would like to thank Tobago Civil Net for having me as the moderator for tonight's discussion. It has been too short. We must do it again and expand the discussion on other issues relevant to Tobago's development. So good night, Dr. James. Good night, Ms. Moore. Good night, Mr. Richards. And good night to the listening audience. Thank you very much. It has
good night, Stephen.
Sure, take care.
Good night, Chrislyn.